what I'm going to start saying, I'm going to talk about the blessings of God for a minute. I'm going to try not digress too far. I'm going to tell you what I went out in Lincoln yesterday, and I'm terrible with directions. I don't know whether anybody knows this of me. I'm absolutely rubbish with directions. I wander off. I think it's because I look at the floor when I walk, and I skulk off, and then I look up and I'm lost, and I can't get from A to B without getting completely lost. So I was out in Lincoln yesterday with the kids, and Nat's doing a police training in Lincoln, and we thought we'd meet her afterwards. Went out for a nice day, and we got there for about 10:30. Sort of 3 o'clock rolls around, and I'm like, oh, what do I do? We've gone to cafes, we've gone wandering around, we've done so much stuff, and it's getting to the point where I'm like, oh, I don't know what to do. The temperature's dropping, and I was just thinking, come on, what am I going to do? And we decided to go off the main street, away from a steep hill, which I don't usually do because I do get lost. And we went for a walk on the park, and we found this museum, an art gallery. It's absolutely splendid, and there was some art. There was like some Dali in there, and some Andy Warhol, and some Picasso. It was on tour around the country, and I was just, the way God blessed this kind of like day out. It was completely unexpected. Just turned up, and it was just nice. I was in a situation where I thought, oh my goodness, I'm freezing cold. I've got nowhere to take the kids. And all of a sudden, this museum and art gallery turned up, and it was free to get in, and it was absolutely brilliant. I had a really good afternoon. And it's just nice when God does that. He takes what could have been quite miserable and takes like the smallest cry of your heart and turns it into something absolutely brilliant. But anyway, back to Nehemiah. I'm going to talk today about what to do when you find yourself coming across trouble, when you find yourself a bit wounded. Nehemiah here he's just heard some terrible news. It's incredibly bad news. And he's at a point here where his walk with God could go one of two ways. When we become wounded, when we suffer trials, these are the points in our Christian walk where there's the most spiritual activity. These are the points where there is the most kind of pull to go left or right, whether you walk towards God or whether you turn away from Him. When we suffer these wounds and this trauma. Nehemiah heard this terrible news, and it was harsh. He found out that the city that he loved and his people were in trouble, and he wasn't happy about it, and it affected him. We're going to look at what he did in a moment, the way that he reacted to it. First, we'll talk about what happens to you physically when you hear kind of bad news. There are certain things that can happen to you that can wound your soul. They can upset your heart. Man is a triune body. Man is we're built with three. We are spirit, we have a soul, and we live in a body. That's the way it works. Your soul is kind of like your mind, your will, and your emotions, and it's vulnerable to trauma. It's vulnerable to it can become wounded, and it can become hurt. And just as your body can become hurt, your soul is just as vulnerable. Medically, it's called post-traumatic stress. If you suffer some kind of trauma, the effects of it can last for years and years afterwards. And it's not necessarily something as traumatic as living through or going through a war. It can be anything that can affect your soul. The way that we're built is brilliant. The way that God works with us is spectacular. As a Christian, your spirit is saved, your soul is being saved, and your body will be saved. That's the way that it works. In Romans it tells you to don't be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's your soul being saved. It's in the process. But when we become wounded, stuff can happen to us. It can put us down. It can make us feel upset, and it can be anything that can wound you. It can be any kind of trauma that can affect you. Doesn't have to be big, and it doesn't have to be a violent trauma. It can be something as simple as arguing with your spouse, losing somebody you love, being stuck in a dead-end job. All of these things can cause wounds to your soul. And when this happens, it causes sensitive areas in your life. It causes you to be vulnerable to even more attack and even more trauma. It just makes it worse. It's like a drop of blood in the ocean to sharks. When the enemy gets hold of something and is aware that you're traumatized in this certain area, just attacks and attacks and attacks, and it won't stop. You have to resist, and there's this kind of thing. We deal very well with our body when we're traumatized, don't you? If you fall over and break your leg, or you know exactly what to do. You go to the hospital, you get it fixed, and we're aware of it being fixed. But often, when you have this, when you have a wounded soul, we kind of have a brush it under the carpet mentality, stiff upper lip, just sweep it under there. We'll deal with that later. And in my experience, it never works. I can tell you that I'm really good at screwing up. That's one of the things I'm good at. If somebody said, "What's your talent?" I can take something that's absolutely fine and turn the situation into something volatile and ridiculous. I have this capacity to not be able to function and make a mess of things. And in doing so, when I've done this before and swept under the carpet and just said, "Okay, we'll deal with that later," or we'll just pretend it never happens, it doesn't work. When you argue with somebody, if you have an argument with your wife or your husband, and you just okay, it doesn't get resolved, but you leave it, and you think, "Yeah, we'll pretend that doesn't happen," and you try and work on it, and it is like trying to walk over, I don't know, I can't describe it. It's dangerous. Something's going to explode, and it's not really dealt with, and it never goes away, and you can feel it inside you that there's something not quite right. But that's what we do with that trauma, and that's what causes our souls to be wounded. We end up carrying baggage. That's the way it's going. You end up feeling heavier than you were before. Nothing feels lighter when you brush it under the carpet. We should go to God with our problems. We should trust in God. I don't know why we don't. Sometimes I feel like I can deal with my issues. Personally, I feel like I can do it on my own. And I feel like God's either indifferent to my pain or afraid of it. He's not going to deal with it. And God isn't like that. God is neither indifferent or afraid of your pains or your trauma or the things that you're going through. In Exodus 3, verses 6 to 9, it says, "Moreover," this is God talking to Moses, he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, "I've surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry." God hears when you're upset. God wants to help you. God wants to come and be with you. It's out of the darkest periods of your life that the light shines the brightest. If we look at, I'm going to flick forward now, I'm going to look at John, let's look at Lazarus. Is that it's in John 11. John 11, 38 to 44. Jesus, therefore again, groaning in himself, comes to the grave. It was a cave and a stone lay upon it. And Jesus said, "Take ye away the stone, Martha." Martha, the sister of him that was dead, and said unto him, "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he has been dead 4 days. And Jesus said to her, said I not unto you, that if you would believe, you should see the glory of God? And they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank thee that you have heard me. And I knew that you hear me always, but because of the people which stand by, I said that if they may believe that you have sent me. And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. And his face was bound about with a napkin, and Jesus said to him, loose him and let him go. Now, God isn't afraid of your pain. We're looking at here, this is, can you imagine? My Bible says here, the unbelief of Martha. Can you imagine just how traumatic that would have been for her? You know, he's buried, he's been dead for 4 days, and she's kind of like, you know, searching for some kind of closure. There's a big stone across the grave. Jesus says, move in. She's like, oh, please, it's going to stink. He's been in there 4 days. He's started to decompose. I don't want to go through this. I don't want to look at this. You know, this is my brother who is, he's dead. That's really hard to deal with. And Jesus said, you know, come on. Let's just believe in me. Let's look at this. Look at who I am. You'll see who I am. Let's get it sorted. He went in and he caused Lazarus to come back from the dead. That's absolutely brilliant. He gave life back to Lazarus. Can you imagine how astounding that must have been? From that pit that Martha was in. I'm not, you know, Lazarus was probably pretty happy too, but Martha was in this pit, this well of depression. And that's when Jesus came in and shone this light and just like came in, and she must have been ecstatic after that. She must have been absolutely astounded. And there's another instance in John 20, verses 24 to 28. We're looking at Thomas. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. This is Jesus after he's been resurrected. He goes to the disciples, and Thomas doesn't see it. The other disciples therefore said unto him, we have seen the Lord. But he said unto them, except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days again, his disciples were within, Thomas was with them, and then came Jesus, the doors being shut, stood in the midst, and said, peace be to you. And then he said, Thomas, reach here with your finger, and behold my hand. And reach here with your hand, and thrust it into my side. And be not faithless, but believing. And Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. You know, this is from Jesus' wounds here. Thomas gets this revelation that Jesus is God. That's the most important revelation that we could ever have, and it's from Jesus' wounds that Thomas gets this. I kind of relate to Thomas. I won't say like the way that he deals with this is one of those. He thinks he's being noble in the fact that he's saying, no, unless I see, I'm not going to believe. And it's like he thinks that he's doing something right, but in actual fact, it's like, you know, Jesus is. It's not always about seeing. It's about having a little bit of faith. But yeah, it's out these wounded patches that the light shines the brightest, and we have to remember this when we are wounded and we're upset. Psalm 23. There's a reason I picked that is because if you look at Psalm 23 in the light of this, you know, the fact that I can pretty much, you know, the majority of us will be carrying some kind of trauma, whether it's, you know, big or small. It's never small if it's affecting you. It's never small. But I can safely say the majority of us will be carrying some kind of trauma from somewhere along the line. And when we read Psalm 23 with this in mind, it really sinks into our hearts just how much God loves us and will look after us. It says, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down to green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This restoration of our soul. We have to look to God for this. We have to look to Jesus to restore our soul. And we have to understand that from these wounds, from this trauma, God's light will shine. You know when you're completely healed of the trauma in your soul, because when somebody like Thomas comes up and stuffs his fingers in it, you don't wince, you don't recoil in pain, but what actually happens is God's light shines through and somebody sees a massive revelation of who God actually is. And when we look to God with our trauma, God can heal it, and then more people will be able to see this. More people will be able to see this revelation of God through who we are and what we've done. Nehemiah, I look at how Nehemiah dealt with this shocking blow, this news that he had. It was extremely... Oh, I need that. It was harsh. We really had to put ourselves in this position. It was such a difficult piece of news to hear. It was hard to swallow. And Nehemiah, this is Nehemiah's 6-point step for dealing with six steps for dealing with stress. It comes in verse 4, chapter 1, verse 4. It came to pass when I heard these words, I sat down, I wept, I mourned certain days, I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah's prayer, which Rach looked at last week, is a brilliant prayer. If you read through Nehemiah's prayer, he doesn't actually ask God for anything. He asks God to listen at the start of the prayer, and that's about it. The rest of it is quoting God's word back to him. He's talking about what God's promised. But his one request to God is that you listen and open your eyes and see what's going on. Didn't pray for builders, didn't pray for bricks. He just said, God, come on, let's look at what's going on. We'll look at prayer in a minute. His first step, what Nehemiah did, the first thing he did was he heard the report. He listened. This is one of those things that I'm not very good at. In fact, as we go through this list, there's not one of these things that I am very good at. When it comes down to it, I can say here, I can stand here and say, yeah, we can do this. But when it actually comes down to it, and you're in the middle of a stressful situation, it's a lot harder. I'm not going to lie to you. But the first thing he did is he listened. He heard the report. I'm not going to start listing off the Bible verses that talk about listening, but there's a few that jump out. Isaiah 51:1. In fact, there are several Bible verses that start with God saying, listen to me. Listen to me. Hear me, O you people. Mark 7:14. Jesus says, hear me, everyone, and understand. Listening is a key part of dealing with stress and anguish and trauma. If we listen, instead of jumping in and talking, we can understand things a lot more. The second thing that Nehemiah did was to sit down. When we sit down, it sounds ridiculous. Sit down. It stops us from acting rashly. It stops us from jumping up and doing stupid things. Nehemiah could have kicked off. If I was in Nehemiah's shoes, I probably would have kicked off. I'd have stormed off and I'd have walked down to Jerusalem and I'd have just been, I'd have hulked out. But he didn't. He sat down. He listened and he sat down. The third thing he did was he wept. Weeping, when we cry, it's physiologically, it's like it's our body dealing with emotion. It's our body kind of working out all of the emotional stress and pain. Weeping and crying will stop you from kicking off and fighting and punching and thrashing out. Because if we don't weep sometimes, if we don't settle down and really consider what's happening to us and what our situation's like, then there is this chance where this energy, this emotion will build up and we'll lash out. We'll go for some kind of cathartic, kick cat kind of release. You come in after a stressful day at work and take it out on everybody else. It builds up gradually. And when we suffer trauma, even more so. So weeping is good to do. It's good to weep. The fourth step, is he mourned. Now, mourning is it's something that we all have to go through at some point. It's something that we all face at some point. Ecclesiastes 7 verses 1 to 4 talk about the importance of mourning. It says, "A good man is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go into the house of mourning than to go into the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth." Mourning helps us to consider what's happened. It helps our body to almost digest the trauma that has happened to us. When we mourn, it's a physical act. Some people, you draw the curtains or you wear black. It's something you do to comprehend the stress and strain that has happened to you. It's how we deal with this anguish again, this trauma. The fifth and sixth step come together quite well. They're fasting and prayer. I'd like to say I enjoy fasting. I'd like to say it's one of my top things I love to do. But I really like food. It's what lots of us really like food. But when we fast, it's something amazing happens to you, and it gives you this constant realization that God is with you. It's you saying to God, "I'm giving up the thing that sustains me for you." And there are plenty of fasts in the Bible when you read through them. There are massive, great sort of supernatural 40-day fasts. There are vegetarian fasts, Daniel does. And there are sort of 3-day, 3-night fasts. But as you go through the Bible and you read about fasting, that people fast for various reasons. But when you're praying and fasting because you've suffered a trauma, it's you becoming closer to God. You get this a connection with God because you're actively seeking Him out. You're putting aside your food and you're working towards accessing God's heart. That's what we do when we're in this kind of situation and we're saying, look, let's just look towards God and let's just pray. When you fast and pray together, you have to be praying when you're fasting. If you're not praying while fasting, you're just starving yourself. You have to be looking to get closer towards God. And that's what Nehemiah did, steps 5 and 6. He fasted and he prayed, and his prayer is absolutely brilliant. It's one of those kind of underline it in your Bible because it's a mega prayer. And he gets closer to God, and through this prayer, it sets up a chain of events that ends up with the walls becoming rebuilt and restoration. It's this prayer and fasting is brilliant. I can tell you if you stop eating sometimes because of trauma. Something happens, food goes straight out the window and you don't think about it, and your brain's just set on something. If we focus something that our brain's set on God, then it helps to work out and resolve the trauma that's going on. I'm not very good at this. This is one of these things, these 6 steps that Nehemiah goes through. I can perhaps fail at every single one of them. I'm not very clever at all. whenever I encounter trauma or something stressful that happens to me, whenever this happens to me personally, I turn into a child, and I end up stressing out. Like I'm 27 this year, 28, 27, and I can still have a panic. And I try really hard to get these 6 steps down, to work on these 6 steps that Nehemiah goes through, and they're a lot harder than they seem. Listening and sitting down, and weeping and mourning and fasting and praying. But it's that they're important, and they'll help you to get closer to God, so that He can restore your soul, so that He can restore that trauma that you're suffering. He can help to build that up. And to list the things that can cause trauma to your soul could take all day. I think I can go through, your parents split up at an early age. You can carry that for your whole life. You can carry the loss of somebody you love for your whole life. And the only way you can deal with it is getting closer to God. When I was, my testimony and brief run was to look at the trauma that I suffered without even realising it. My parents really looked after me. I was almost spoiled as a child. I always had everything that I needed. And when I hit sort of 16, 17, I started experimenting with drugs. And it caused trauma to my soul. I hit sort of, when I'm 18, 19, I started drinking a lot more. I started taking lots of cocaine. It caused trauma to my soul. And I built up this shield, this picture of who I should be. This outward image of Dave. And Dave can do anything. And it caused trauma to my soul because I built myself up so high with alcohol and drugs that I just kept falling. And it got to the point where I wouldn't be eating. We'd just constantly be taking Class A drugs, and it just caused trauma to my soul. I'd suffer breakup after breakup. I would sleep with anything that came by, and it caused trauma to my soul. And when I became a Christian, and this stopped, my spirit became saved instantly. My spirit became taken to God. I became linked with God. My body will be saved. I've got no worries about that. My soul is something that is a work in progress. And there are still signs of that trauma. I can't go to the dentist without getting all fidgety because the Novocaine injection sets something off my brain, and I get like cocaine fever and start getting all itchy and twitchy and weird. It's caused trauma to my soul, and it's stuff that hasn't left. And it's only by getting closer to God that we will become healed of this trauma. It's only through my walk with Jesus that I get closer to Him, and He can heal this trauma that goes on that happens to me. And we're all like this, and it's at these points, these Nehemiah points, when you hear bad news, when something goes wrong, and you literally have this kind of, you've got the id on one side, the superego on the other. You've got the devil and the angel, one on each shoulder, and there's a point where you can go one of two ways. And you're either going to take tremendous steps forward towards Jesus, or you're going to take steps far away from Him. But He'll always be there to pick you up when you fall. It's these points when this trauma happens that we can get close to God. His light can shine through us, and He can work with us. I'll close in prayer, and then we'll sing our last 2 songs. We'll leave it there.